Hi, I'm Dave. During my career, I've worked with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which is part of Department of Interior, the National Park Service, which is also part of the Department of Interior, the Bureau of Land Management, which is part of Department of Interior, and NOAA National Marine Fisheries, which is Department of Commerce. So I have a pretty good understanding of public lands, how they were created, um, what authority under the Constitution they were created, and listening to the news and TV and both the far right, the far left, both have a very big misunderstanding of public lands, how the different agencies are very separate in their functions on what's allowed on different sections of public lands. And I thought I'd try to educate people. You may not agree, and I encourage you to do your own research, but based on my knowledge, 25 years, I thought I'd give you a quick rundown and try to keep it simple. So, first of all, when people say the federal government doesn't have constitutional authority to have all this millions and millions of acres, that's not true. And so we go through the Constitution and see what it says. And the first section I also want to tell people is Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2 of the United States Constitution includes the Treaty Clause, which empowers the President of the United States to propose and chiefly negotiate agreements which must be confirmed by the Senate between the United States and other countries. This is a function this is straight out of the U.S. Constitution. So the President and our Congress, the Senate, can negotiate treaties. One of the most important treaties was the Louisiana Purchase back in 1802. The U.S. acquired hundreds of millions of acres of land, bought it using taxpayer dollars. President Thomas Jefferson bought hundreds of millions of acres of land that belonged to the U.S. government. So now we have this big giant section that went from Louisiana all the way up into Wyoming, I believe, and it included much of the Midwest. That's why a lot of the Midwest towns have French names. Terre Haute, Indiana, La Crosse, Wisconsin, Du Bois, Iowa, Marquette, Michigan are just some examples. These were French trading posts. This was land owned by the French. Napoleon needed money desperately for his wars, so he sold this big chunk of North America to a new country called the United States of America. And during these discussions that I'm talking about, I want to make sure I fully understand when people talk about Native Americans owning it before and it was taken from them, that can be argued, absolutely, but for the sake of the Constitution and the laws that we live by now, the United States government bought this giant piece of land. The U.S. government would buy millions of other pieces of land. There was the Treaty of Hidalgo after the Mexican War. We acquired California, Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, Colorado, I believe maybe parts of Utah. It was a huge chunk of land. Then you had the Oregon Treaty dealing with Washington and Oregon and Idaho buying from the British. And we'll talk about Seward's Treaty with the Russians to get Alaska. So now you can see how the United States is being formed through all these treaties. The government is in fact buying land, and the Constitution says the government can do that. It can enter into a treaty which included the buying of all this property. Now the original 13 states that were created, they are under a different set of rules than the western states. Now this is important to understand. Nevada, 80% of Nevada is public lands. How can that be? Well, there's something called Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2 of the U.S. Constitution, the Property Clause. And this talks about in order for a U.S. territory to become a state, it allowed the states agreeing to allow the federal government to keep whatever property it had at that time. And it says Congress shall have the power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States. And then it says that nothing in this Constitution shall be so construed as to prejudice any claims of the United States or any particular state. So it's talking about right here saying the federal government can make rules and regulations about property belonging to the United States. The government can own property. It can be a landowner. And so states like Nevada, in their enabling legislation to become a state, you look at each and every one of them, Wyoming and Utah, Colorado, all these western states are saying, we'll let the federal government keep what they have if we can become a state. Now here's a section that applies to the eastern states. Under Section 8, Constitution, and it says, and to exercise authority over all places purchased by the consent of the legislator of the state in which shall be for erection forts, magazines, arsenal, dockyards, and other needful buildings, and. So let's say the state of Virginia that has the very beautiful Shenandoah National Park. I grew up near there. It's a beautiful park. The federal government didn't just go buy that land and say, this is now a national park. The state of Virginia seized and condemned that land from property owners there, and that wasn't right, but the state did that. The state of Virginia wanted a national park in their state to help with tourism and to bring in money. Once they acquired the property, they said to the federal government, we want this to be a national park. Our state is allowing you to acquire this property. And the federal government, with the consent of Congress, said, okay, we'll take this property and we'll create it as a national park. So the same process went through for Acadia National Park or the White Mountain and Green Mountain National Forest up in New Hampshire and Vermont, Canaveral National Seashore, all these different national parks on the East Coast, the Everglades. All these parks only came about because the state acquired it and then gave permission for the federal government to own it. So this wasn't the government stealing land or taking it. This was the state saying, we want these in our states. In the West, you have some national park units that were created before the state became a state while it was still a territory. Yellowstone National Park. That was created by President Grant. There wasn't even a park service at that time. But he had heard that this was an amazing place, and he created as the first national park, but it was under the Department of War. So the U.S. Army was in control of it. It was really Fort Yellowstone. And so that's why the first park rangers were actually U.S. cavalry officers. Some of the other big parks, for example, Yosemite in California, created before the state of California was a state. And that goes back to Abraham Lincoln. He had seen some photos and reports and decided that this would be an important place to protect. And so he didn't call it a national park, but he decided to give it some form of protection. So what about these hundreds and hundreds of millions of acres of BLM lands, the Bureau of Land Management? Well, going way back to the Louisiana Purchase, Thomas Jefferson created a General Lands Accounting Office. I believe it was under the Department of War at the time. This was a federal agency created in 1802 to manage or to at least map and find out how much lands we acquired during the purchase. Much of that territory had not been explored. It was remote wilderness that European settlers had not been to. So Thomas Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark out to explore this new purchase. So now you're getting an understanding of how all this land came about. For over 100 years, the General Lands Accounting Office had just millions and millions and millions of acres of land all over this country. Once you get into the beginning of the 20th century, um, Theodore Roosevelt, he's noticing that some of these lands have some really unique features. So he used his power under the Antiquities Act to create national monuments. And so his national monuments would be like Devil's Tower in Wyoming, very unique geologic feature, and he took land that was already owned by the federal government, but he called a very small section of 1,000 acres. He said, this is going to be a national monument. And that would eventually be turned over to the National Park Service. Now, in recent years, not all national monuments have been turned over to the Park Service. Some of them have stayed with the Bureau of Land Management. We also, along the way, I believe Grover Cleveland started creating, President Grover Cleveland in the late 1800s, took lands out of that General Lands Accounting Office and created national forest preserves. And I believe under Theodore Roosevelt, he would actually create a separate agency under the Department of Agriculture called the National Forest Service. And the National Forest Service would take these national forest preserves and create national forest out of them. So also by the early 20th century, we saw the creation of national wildlife refuges. And so the ones back east were created where the states gave the federal government permission to buy land. Congress approved it, and then they created national wildlife refuges. You also would eventually have the Duck Stamp Act that would allow hunters to, hunting waterfowl, they would have to get a duck stamp. And that stamp was used for the purchase of new lands to help with the production of more waterfowl. So all these lands were never, at least on the west side of the country, these were not private property that was taken or seized. These were lands that already was owned by the federal government. And the government along the way had the Homesteading Act. So they allowed homesteaders to homestead on property. And so most of the Midwest was homesteaded. The Great Land Rush in Oklahoma is an example of that. But in the West, you had lands that were not suitable for farming or ranching, especially the high country, high deserts. You know, even if you go to a state like Nevada that's mostly public lands, areas along rivers, for example, is private property. Those were homesteaded pretty early on. The people back in that time, they could graze and get timber off these public lands. There wasn't a need to acquire those lands. They could graze their cows on them. They could cut trees down. Timber companies could go in. They could mine gold and silver off these public lands. So it's like, why, maybe in their minds, I'm guessing back in the 1800s, why acquire this land when the government owns it and you can use it? So hopefully you're starting to understand where these lands came from, how they were acquired. And again, it's all within the Constitution. It says this was all legal and allowed to be. The problem that I see a lot of times now is also like bear's ears. Right now, President Trump is the President of the United States, and Bears Ears was a national monument created by President Barack Obama. Now, President Barack Obama took a section of BLM land, Bureau of Land Management, Department of Interior, and basically drew a circle and said this is a very special area, it's going to be a national monument. The rules, I don't think they changed a lot. Maybe in the future there might be some more restrictions put in place for oil and gas, but it's still BLM land. And BLM has its own legislation from the 1970s, the Federal Land Management Protection Act, FLPMA, that says that it's multi-use lands. Cattle, hunting, timber, mining, oil and gas. All these different multiple use things can occur on BLM lands. President Trump, when he became president, him and the Secretary of Interior decided to shrink the size of Bear's Ear, the national monument. But he didn't give it away or sell it. It's all the stuff that's no longer part of the original national monument boundary is still BLM land. It's still public land. You could still go out there and visit it. So when I hear people saying the president's selling off public lands left and right, no, it's not true. He didn't sell, and Bears Ear is not a national park. It's not under the Park Service's specific legislation. All the federal agencies have different federal acts that give them certain authorities and purpose as to how they manage things. So the National Park Service is about protection, preservation, and letting nature take its course, or protecting historic sites, preserving. The Bureau of Land Management, multi-use. You can do a lot of things. You can collect rocks, you can drive around on your ATV, you can sand dunes, your dune buggies, you can hunt and fish, target shoot, camp wherever you want, cut down trees for firewood if you get a permit. But I mean, there's a lot of different activities you can do there that you can't do on a national park unit. You have a national forest system and national grasslands that's very similar to BLM, very similar. It's multi-use. And again, mining, grazing, timber harvest, hunting, fishing, trapping, dispersed camping. So there's a lot of different things you can do on a national forest that you can't do on a national park. And then you have national wildlife refuges. Now these were lands that were created to enhance habitat. So on a national wildlife refuge, they're building wetlands, marshes, dikes. They may grow crops, which, half of it goes to wildlife, half goes to the farmer. So they have cooperative farming units on national wildlife refuges. They'll allow hunting and fishing if it's compatible, and it's almost always compatible. Hunting deer on a 10,000 acre national wildlife refuge is not going to harm the deer population. It's a good way of managing it. Hunting and fishing on national wildlife refuges is very restrictive, and so there's special rules and regulations on how much you can take, if you're fishing, what your limits are, and so those activities are built into the National Wildlife Refuge Administrative Act. So these are the different things. You have also, under NOAA, National Marine Fisheries Service, you have National Marine Sanctuaries. So it's sections of the ocean, or there's some in the Great Lakes, I believe, that the bottom of the seabed or lake bed is the actual sanctuary. And some sanctuaries have been turned into monuments. It's very confusing. And the National Monument System can be used for any of the different things. So Forest Service has national monuments. U.S. Fish and Wildlife has national monuments. Park Service, BLM. But all those different national monuments still have to fall under the rules and regulations for the specific agency that has that national monument. National monuments were originally created to be very special places, very unique places. The Grand Canyon was originally a national monument. It's an amazing place. But in recent years, they've been turned into kind of a political tool to get votes. One example I give is the San Gabriel National Monument in Southern California. You have the Angeles National Forest, and a section of it was the San Gabriel Wilderness, a congressionally designated wilderness. Gets the highest protections, federal wilderness areas. President Barack Obama came in and said, I'm going to call this a national monument. What does that mean? Well, it's a name. The rules didn't become more restrictive because it's already got the highest restrictions as a wilderness area. So all he did was draw a line around a wilderness and call it a national monument. But when he says it publicly that he cares so much about the wilderness, he also said that he did it in the name of promoting Latino culture. Well, he's trying to get votes, plain and simple. There's not additional funding for this national monument. There's no additional specific rules or regulations. I don't even think they have signs up yet for it. But on maps and on brochures, it says it's a national monument. And for the president, for millions of voters that looked at him and liked him, say, wow, he cares about the environment. He's creating this national monument, this very beautiful area, the San Gabriel Mountains. But they were already protected. But again, most of the public doesn't quite understand how this all works. And it is very complicated. And you can argue pros and against public land ownership or whether the states should manage it. I don't think for some public lands that would be a bad thing. I think the National Park Service does a very good job. And they stayed very focused for the most part. The BLM, having the states manage those lands, still keeping it in federal ownership so the public, like you and me, can still go out there and collect rocks and camp and hunt and fish is good. But having a state manage it is not going to change it very much. But that's a different argument for a different day. But this was today just me telling you from the Constitution, the federal government can own land, it can own property, it can manage these properties. And we have to have more discussion, polite discussion, on the best way to manage these. Anyway, I hope this is helpful, and have a good day.